before Yellowstone had wolves, before Florida restored the Everglades, before anyone believed nature could heal itself. Scientists did something so outrageous that most Americans called it madness. They dumped millions of crabs into a dying forest. And 5 years later, what they found left the entire country speechless. If you care about the future of our land, our wildlife, and the bold ideas that change history, hit subscribe right now, because this story proves that sometimes the most unbelievable solutions are the ones that save the world. It began in the quiet, forgotten stretch of woodland along the Gulf Coast near Louisiana, where thousands of acres of cypress and oak had once stood tall before saltwater intrusion, industrial runoff, and a series of violent hurricanes turned the soil toxic and lifeless. The forest floor had hardened into a crusted wasteland where nothing grew. Deer vanished, birds stopped nesting, and even insects seemed to avoid the place, earning it a grim nickname among locals, the Silent Timber. Federal ecologists from agencies based in Washington, D.C. had tried everything: replanting native saplings, trucking in fresh soil, introducing controlled burns. But every effort failed as the compacted earth suffocated roots and the ecosystem collapsed further each year. Until a young marine biologist named Dr. Elena Marquez proposed something that sounded less like science and more like a dare: import millions of burrowing crabs from the coastal marshlands and unleash them into the forest to re-engineer the soil from the ground up. Her theory was inspired by studies of mangrove ecosystems in Australia, where crab populations aerated sediment, redistributed nutrients, and revived plant growth after cyclones. If crabs could transform suffocating mud into breathable habitat along shorelines, she argued, perhaps they could do the same for poisoned forest ground, digging channels, breaking apart hardened layers, cycling organic material, and jump-starting microbial life. Critics laughed. Talk radio hosts mocked the crab forest fiasco. A viral segment compared it to releasing lobsters in New York City's Central Park. But after years of failure and mounting public pressure, the Restoration Council approved a contained experimental release: 10 million marsh crabs transported in climate-controlled trucks and carefully distributed across fenced sectors of the Silent Timber. The first months looked like disaster. The forest floor appeared to writhe at night. Trails collapsed under tiny burrows, and raccoons feasted so heavily that wildlife cameras captured what looked like chaotic feeding frenzies. Nearby residents complained about the smell of brine, and late-night conspiracy forums insisted the government was hiding something far darker beneath the soil. Then came the first twist. Unexpected flooding during hurricane season breached part of the fencing, allowing thousands of crabs to escape beyond the controlled zone. Headlines exploded, politicians demanded hearings, and funding was nearly pulled as footage showed crabs marching across rural roads under headlights like an invading army. Yet when the water receded, satellite scans revealed something astonishing. Areas where crabs had tunneled showed measurable decreases in soil compaction and increased moisture retention compared to untouched zones. And within 6 months, faint green shoots began appearing in patterns tracing the densest burrow clusters. By year 1, the forest no longer felt silent. Insects returned first: beetles, ants, and dragonflies, drawn to the newly loosened soil and emerging plant life, followed by frogs whose croaks echoed through lowland pools that hadn't held water in years. Still, not everything was hopeful. An invasive vine species exploded in growth thanks to the improved soil conditions, threatening to choke out the fragile native seedlings, forcing Dr. Marquez's team into a desperate race to manually remove acres of creeping green before it undid all progress. Meanwhile, a shocking internal audit uncovered that a private contractor supplying the crabs had mixed in a non-native species known for aggressive territorial behavior, sparking fear that the experiment could spiral into ecological catastrophe. Emergency genetic surveys were launched, and for weeks, the fate of the entire project hung in balance as biologists tracked crab populations with fluorescent tagging under ultraviolet drones at night. Against expectations, the non-native crabs failed to dominate. Instead, natural predation and habitat differences limited their spread, and the native marsh crabs thrived, continuing their relentless underground engineering. By year 2, something even more remarkable occurred. Seed banks long dormant beneath the hardened crust began to germinate. Species of wild grass and understory shrubs that hadn't been recorded in over a decade pushing towards sunlight as if awakened from a long sleep. Researchers from universities in Austin and Atlanta arrived to study the microbial renaissance happening below ground, discovering that crab tunnels were acting like ventilation shafts. oxygenating deeper layers and allowing fungi networks to reconnect across vast distances, effectively rebuilding the forest's communication system. The third year brought another twist no one predicted. Migratory birds began rerouting their paths to include the recovering forest, and with them came seeds carried from distant wetlands, accelerating biodiversity in ways no restoration blueprint had envisioned. Local hunters who once dismissed the project reported sightings of white-tailed deer browsing among saplings, and motion-activated cameras captured the first bobcat in nearly 15 years, slipping between young trees at dawn. But controversy reignited when a viral documentary accused the program of manipulating data, claiming that natural climate cycles, not crabs, deserved credit for the rebound. Public trust wavered until independent reviewers conducted blind soil comparisons between crab-engineered plots and untouched control zones, conclusively demonstrating significantly higher nutrient cycling and root penetration in the former. Year 4 tested everything. An extreme drought scorched the region, threatening to undo progress. Yet areas dense with crab burrows retained underground moisture like sponges, reducing tree mortality dramatically compared to adjacent lands. What had once seemed like reckless interference now appeared to be a buffer against climate extremes. Children from nearby towns visited on field trips, planting saplings into soft earth teeming with life, their teachers explaining how unlikely heroes sometimes carry shells instead of capes. And then, in the 5th year, during a routine biodiversity census at sunrise, a graduate student hiking through Sector 7 froze at the sound of something that hadn't been heard there in nearly 20 years. The resonant drumming call of a pileated woodpecker echoing through a canopy that was finally thick enough to answer back. Above her, sunlight filtered through interlaced branches of young cypress and oak, and beneath her boots the soil gave gently, alive, and breathing. When comprehensive satellite imagery was released weeks later, the transformation stunned the nation. What had been a gray scar visible from space now glowed deep green, a contiguous forest once again stitching wetlands to uplands in a living corridor. Carbon sequestration estimates exceeded projections, groundwater quality improved, and neighboring communities reported reduced storm surge impact thanks to the restored buffer. The silent timber was silent no more. In a televised address from a boardwalk overlooking the reborn woodland, Dr. Marquez stood not as the reckless scientist critics once mocked, but as proof that bold experimentation, guided by data, adjusted by humility, and sustained through public scrutiny, can rewrite the fate of a landscape. Yet perhaps the greatest twist was philosophical. The crabs were never saviors alone. They were catalysts, reminding Americans that restoration sometimes requires partnering with overlooked forces of nature rather than overpowering them. 5 years after millions of small armored engineers were released into a broken forest, the experiment that sounded insane became a blueprint studied nationwide, influencing coastal resilience projects from Florida to California, reshaping how scientists think about soil, species interactions, and second chances. And if this story proves anything, it's that the line between absurd and extraordinary is often just 5 years of patience, courage, and millions of tiny claws digging tirelessly beneath our feet.